Hallo, hei. Velkommen til denne plattformtalken. Jeg kommer til å snakke på engelsk herfra med NUA. Fint å se at I hvert fall noen her på denne høstferie, litt russete dagen. So welcome everyone to this platform talk on the occasion of Edgar Calel's exhibition Ni Musmut. So my name is Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, and I have had the privilege of co-curating this exhibition downstairs together with Axel Vidar. And today we are so lucky to have with us Pablo José Ramírez. And Ramírez is based in Los Angeles, usually where he's the curator at the Hammer Museum. But we're lucky to catch him while being in Europe. So Ramírez just arrived straight from London like an hour ago, where he curated a section of frieze, which was a fantastic selection of works in ceramics that explored the bond between ceramics and non-Western histories. That was a very short description, but at least it was very good, and I was lucky to see it the other day. So before we begin, a short introduction to Ramírez's background so that you have a little bit of context. So he holds an MA in Contemporary Art Theory from Goldsmiths, University of London, and from 2019 to 2023, he was the inaugural adjunct curator of First Nations and Indigenous art at Tate Modern, where he played a key role in shaping the acquisition strategy and advancement of Indigenous and non-Western practice. And Ramírez was part of the curatorial council of the 58th Carnegie International with Sohrab Mohebbi, and recently he co-curated with Diana Nawi the critically acclaimed Biennale made in LA 2023, Acts of Living. Ramírez received the 2019 Independent Curators International CPPC Award for Central America and the Caribbean. And he has published extensively, including pieces of Artforum for Artforum, e-flux, Arts of the Working Class, Artishock, and several catalogues and books. And for the talk here at Bergen Kunsthall, Ramírez will present an overview of his practice regarding curatorial methodologies and engagement with Brown and Indigenous artistic practice. And as usual, I have to do a little bit of the regulars before we begin. So the toilets are here to my left. And also, since we have an online audience, there's a little bit of a Q&A. This will take maybe 40 minutes, and then you can ask questions afterwards. Then my colleague here, June, will take this mic. So if you have, if you're not too shy, then it's great to use the mic for the questions, so our online audience can also hear it. And then I also want to say thank you to everyone who's made this possible, which also includes Henrik and June and Nora and Sofia. And then I will just give the word over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Silja. It's very strange to have this and not. I was like, my impulse was to grab a mic or something. Thank you for the invitation to the Bergen Kunsthall, and I'm happy we made it work. A little on a rush, but right on time, you know, always on time. So I'm gonna talk about my practice with regards to, I guess, indigeneity, and I'll try to introduce some key ideas or concepts around indigeneity in relation to contemporary art, but also I guess kind of like a critical view on what in my view it's kind of like a very kind of like the nuances of indigeneity and why it's such a complicated thing to talk about, and why it's so it's kind of like a minor field. And at this point, you know, after, I mean, I'm sure most of you, one way or another, are related to art. So after the Venice Biennale, this and the previous one, and seeing this kind of like explosion of indigenous artists represented in exhibitions, like in the mainstream art institutions as well, I think that it's kind of like a good time to ask ourselves some questions around like kind of, you know, I guess epistemological questions about what is that we mean when we say indigenous art, but also kind of like try to take a look of like what's going on in the art world, and why is that the art system is able to absorb these practices while at the same time, I guess, kind of obliterate other types of discourses around alterity and the politics of culture. So, and what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about Calel because, well, we have a show here that I'm dying to see, but Sija didn't want me to go first. She was like, it's a surprise, so we will leave it for last. And, well, Calel is an artist I've known for many years, and it's, in a way, kind of, it's not an artist that I work with. Of course, I work with him, but it's an artist that is kind of entrenched in the way I've also developed my own curatorial strategies. Because I do believe that as curators, we learn always from the artist. It's like, and from the art object. So that's kind of like what shapes in our, it's not our histories, it's the art object. So, so I'm gonna start, and sorry if in some cases it feels like a little jumpy. It's gonna go, it's gonna be very introductory, but I think that I need to share some things with you before jumping into Calel and a few other artists that I'll show you. So three big topics. One is temporality, the other is translation, and the other kind of infrastructures, indigeneity. Infrastructures meaning museums, biennales, etc. So let's do it. Temporalities. I'm showing here some kind of like, I guess, theoretical sort of tools or devices that have helped me to think on these ideas. And one is the question of ancestrality. And when I think of indigeneity, I'm thinking on three main temporalities. One is ancestrality, the other is coloniality, and the other is the contemporary, broadly speaking, right? I'm erasing, it's very abrupt, it's obviously a very abrupt cut, but, and I'm starting with ancestrality because in my mind, what defines indigenous contemporary art, like Calel, is its relation to a notion of ancestrality. And the thing with ancestrality is that it's very difficult. We cannot do academic research around ancestrality. We can probably write about it, but it's something that I believe connects. Art has been able to connect to notions of ancestrality in a way that literature and even film has not been able to. And I guess there are many reasons for that, but the other thing with ancestrality is that it's a form of temporalization that is not registered in the Western teleology of time. So what I mean by that is that the time as we know it, also in the Global South, it starts one way or another with colonial times. And then everything that we know before that, it's explained through archaeology and you know, like kind of like a notion of archaeology, broadly speaking. And that's the way, for instance, in Guatemala or Mexico, that we would relate to pre-colonial times, like ruins and myths and so on. So the question about ancestrality is how we think about it in terms of artistic practice and what is that it does in the present, right? How it's just not like something fixed in that kind of like pre-colonial past, but it's something that is activated in the present through, in this case, artistic practices. And this is an example that I've shown many times, and it's these are the bones of Cuauhtémoc. Cuauhtémoc was the last Tlatoani Mexica in what is now Mexico. And a Tlatoani would be a sort of sovereign, like I mean, I guess we would say a king, but it's like a person that kind of embodies the political and the spiritual power. So Cuauhtémoc was murdered by the Spanish settlers, and there was a whole, after that, like, you know, 16th, 17th century, like the bones were disappear. So the idea of not just killing the person, but kind of like hiding the traces of the material, of the, yeah, kind of the remains, I guess you would say. It's interesting because then ancestrality, I mean, under the logic of colonial settlers, is then not just it's not just a matter of life, it's a matter of kind of erasing any possible material trace of, in this case, this person and what it represented. So the bones were hidden, and there were, like, for centuries, and in the early 20th century, someone claimed that knew where the bones of Cuauhtemoc were. And we're talking early 20th century, so that was the emergence of most of the modern nation states in Latin America. So the Mexican state is a kind of like a paradigmatic example of kind of like a mestizo nation state. So the project of the nation state, of the foundation of the nation state, was this sort of what it was called raza cósmica, like the cosmic race, like the kind of mix, let's say, of indigenous and settlers, right? So this person claimed they knew where the bones were. There was a whole speculation around it, and he said that they were under a colonial church. So there was a commission of the official government led by an anthropologist and a group of archaeologists, and then there was an independent commission. And the independent commission was led by Elena Guzman, and the whole thing was, okay, are these the bones of Cuauhtemoc? No, you need to do architectural research, archaeological, etc. And then there were two different kind of reports. The official commission sent by the government said that those were not, while the independent commission led by Elena Guzman said that those were most likely the bones of Cuauhtemoc. In the end, I mean, what is interesting for me about this is that it doesn't matter as such. What it matters is that after like that possibility opened, a whole kind of millennial movement of indigenous, a social movement of indigenous rights kind of emerged. So people would still kind of congregate around the bones. That is, I mean, this is now, and people would visit the tomb, the bones of Cuauhtemoc, once a year. So what is, I mean, how much like a piece of, like an object, like a group of bones can somehow kind of disrupt the discourse around the nation state and around kind of like what we conceive usually as kind of like fixed identities. And in this case, ancestrality is also kind of like an idea, right? That kind of like transforms into some kind of political action. And then, so ancestrality, second temporalization for indigeneity, coloniality. So the whole thing with coloniality, and this is, I mean, in coloniality is where we can trace the origins of the concept of the indigenous. So the concept of the indigenous is kind of, as a concept, is, let's be clear that I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about here, about ideas, or about ideas, right, that take the shape of real things. And the indigenous lives as a concept, this paradox between being a colonial construction, while at the same time opening the path for kind of forms of contemporary emancipation. So what I mean by this is that, again, going back to Latin American societies, coloniality kind of opened the path to a kind of very strange thing where, on one hand, indigenous population would be kind of served as many things, but especially forced labor, while at the same time, the emergence of like a new mestizo class that was, again, a mix of indigenous and colonial Spanish settler came to be. So, this is a graphic by Melchor Garcia Mercado, and it's just very kind of representative of how colonial societies work, but also kind of reflecting on like even like things like a skin type, like how like skin and race and class were somehow entangled in a way that is really, really hard to take it apart at this point. So what we see in Latin American societies most of the times, if we go now, is that you have a group of indigenous population in Guatemala self-identify as indigenous that are around 60%, while a little less than 40 are mestizos, right? So the mestizos in the context of Latin American societies are the ones who have held the power because the nation state is mestizo, so it's an hegemonic group. But if you go to Canada, the Métis are seen as First Nations. And the Métis is also, well, is the French for mestizo, and is a mix of French settler and indigenous. So the question is why in the context, for instance, of Canada, a Métis is indigenous, and in the context of Latin America, a mestizo is not indigenous. Just to speak about nuances. So when we think about, as curators, as writing about indigenous art, it gets very complicated because you cannot kind of get rid of some kind of like ethnographic sort of approach to what you're doing. So the question is how we do shows and at the same time kind of deactivate the common places and the kind of buzzwords of what is indigenous or how we talk about artists in the broadest sense. And just lastly about temporalities, and this is very important, and I'm gonna talk about this with Calel, but I'm just following here the marker that Boris Groy, the art historian, puts in terms of what is contemporary. And for him, contemporary, well, starts in the 89 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the reason for that is that there is this kind of shift between a bipolar world to some kind of like multipolar world, right? And that means that there were, of course, different poles of power, but in the 90s that opened the path to what then came to be a form of neoliberal multiculturalism. So my argument is that what we see now in the art world, when we see representation of different indigenous artists, brown African artists, is an expression of neoliberal multiculturalism. So what we do is somehow trapped in kind of the matrix of that kind of form of late capitalism that is actually pretty agile in the way that absorbs and represents practices that we all work with and engage with. But not only that, but in 1994, there was in the south of Mexico el levantamiento, the search of the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. So the EZLN was important and still important. I mean, it was very famous back in the 90s. Now it's kind of, I mean, not the same attention, at least in the mainstream media. But the EZLN was the first indigenous movement that declared itself as a kind of like planetary movement. So they kind of like unacknowledging or kind of like the taking distance from the Mexican nation state, while at the same time claiming an indigenous kind of like, so let's call it ontology, that was most of all political, and then it was cultural. So this kind of movement that was claiming its indigeneity through political action, not through cultural manifestation. Although, I mean, those things, of course, go side by side. But so, like, for me, those are the two markers in terms of a contemporary form of indigeneity. The Berlin Wall, multipolar world, multiculturalism, and the Zapatismo. And this is just a footnote because I think it's interesting. John Berger met with Marcos and they exchanged actually a few letters that you can find online. And it's very interesting because Berger is talking about he was back then living in the French countryside and he was sending letters to Marcos about the French countryside and art and painting and ways of seeing, I guess. And Marcos was talking about the community and like, you know, kind of how do you live in a Caracol, like a Zapatista community and kids, and what is, if for Berger, his way of seeing is that, what is for a Zapatista kid in the highlands of Chiapas in Mexico. You know? And I'm gonna read this quote, it's the only quote I'm gonna read, I promise, and I wanna clarify, I don't like Zizek. I mean, back in the days, it was interesting. Then it morphed into this kind of sort of reactionary, lefty, conservative politics or something like that. But this is an extract from a book that was, as far as I know, not translated to English. I don't know why I just found it in Spanish long time ago, like one of his first books, very small, about multiculturalism. And I'm going to just read it, so bear with me. The ideal ideological form of global capitalism is multiculturalism. The attitude that, from a hollow global position, treats each and every one of the local cultures in the way that the colonizer usually treats his colonized natives, whose customs are to know and respect. Multiculturalism is an unavowed, inverted, self-referential form of racism, a racism that keeps its distance, it respects the identity of the other, conceives it as an authentic community close in on itself with respect to which he, the multiculturalist, maintains a distance based on the privilege of his own position universal, from which you can appreciate or despise other cultures. And I guess, something that I've been, especially now, thinking a lot is how you see, kind of the limits of multiculturalism, in the sense that, for instance, in the context of the US, you do see a lot of representation, as, like US institutions understand that, so more indigenous brown curators are going to museums and so on. On the other hand, that's not always represented in the collections, which is a different question on the why. But the limit, we sometimes see the limits of multiculturalism, because the tricky part is that it seems like it's just all good, right? So you go, especially in biennales, you are like, okay, so you see like a Tutuhil artist, and then you see like a Amasig artist from North Africa, and everything kind of blends and works together, like aesthetically. So like you cannot see the cracks or the tensions. And I guess that's a good way to understand multiculturalism. And for me, the limits of multiculturalism in this moment are called Palestine, because Palestine show exactly the limits of what we can talk about and what we cannot when we represent artists and when we talk about culture and even indigeneity. But it's just in those moments. So it's like these glimpses where you are like, okay, so this is not allowed, right? We can talk about indigenous art now apparently everywhere, but we cannot do this or that. So, and that's basically how multiculturalism operates. It's kind of a depoliticized form of culture. And I'm not sure yet what is that we can do as curators and institutions to kind of shift or steer that. I think there are many things, but it's kind of like an ongoing question, I guess. Second, very, very quickly, because I don't want to, I'm just trying to stick to time. Okay, I'm good. So translation, just going to a bit more of a methodological part of like how, at least in my own practice, it helps me to think on translation when I work with brown and indigenous artists, and also when I work with artists from across the world. Like I just did a Korean avant-garde show at the Hammer. It was not my project, but I organized the show there, and I learned a lot. So when like the thing for me and the way I put translation in relation to art is that museums are translation, kind of like translation machines, right? Like they operate within translation all the time. And when we do as curators, it's actually the same. The thing is that I feel sometimes when we speak about translation, it's like too fast, like in the sense that there are not nuances to translation. And something I've been working with a lot is with Japanese cultural theorist called Naoki Sakai. He wrote a book on called Translation as Subjectivity, and it's one of the main reference on translation studies, not the only one. But what I mean by that is that, so like when we do a show in Norway of a Tutuhil artist that speaks Cachiquel, that speaks Cachiquel and Spanish. Cachiquel is his first language and Spanish his second. And he's traveling around the world. And he decided one way or another, probably that would change, but he decided that he is not going to learn English now. I told him once, because I was curious, it's like, how do you do it? Because he's traveling all the time, and he is just like, but he was like, I think he doesn't want, and that it's interesting in itself, and it's kind of like a form of reivindicate something. And also, he's very lovely, so everyone would just, it's just everyone welcomes him. So when I speak of translation, I'm talking about like something that is all the time on the move. So it's not that we have like this kind of like fixed subjectivity, like this fixed person, and we translate this kind of ontology into our language or our kind of cultural kind of manifestation. It's more like this fixed identity is not too fixed, and I am not too fixed. So there is something that happens in between. And that in-betweenness is connected to the way we do exhibitions. So how we represent the in-betweenness and the contradictions or the misunderstandings of those translations. Instead of speaking from certainty, how we try to speak from uncertainty and from these kind of nuances, which is not ambiguity. We can take positions but still acknowledge that the conversation is somehow fractured. And something that helped me with this was Sakai has two forms of translation that he kind of sketches in this way. One is that he speaks about, broadly speaking, he says, okay, everything is translated all the time, national cultures, local cultures, indigenous cultures, non-Western cultures. So, and we have a long history in museums, exhibition making with that, starting with the 80s with magicians de la Terre and so on. So he says, okay, so you have homolingual translation and plurilingual translation. For Sakai, homolingual translation, it's kind of connected to the regime of identity politics, right? So it's what I said just now with a mug of coffee. Like, this is a fixed thing that I somehow translate into my kind of regime of truth, right? And the other, like the alternative for Sakai is something he calls plurilingual translation, which is kind of a little more nuanced. And the two differences is that plurilingual translation addresses something, while homolingual translation communicates, quote unquote. And it's a big difference, especially in curatorial practice, what it means to communicate about something, about those art objects, about that chair, and how I write about that chair, and what it means to address the chair. That has to do with curatorial methodologies and how we write and how we display art. And it goes deeper, but what is interesting is that what I just said about multiculturalism, it's actually a form of translation that is violent and that is impulsive in the sense that it imposes meanings. And that's one of the main issues with how curators write about indigeneity or brownness and so on. Because you describe, and in the description, there are many tricks because you cannot kind of represent in a transparent way something you are not part of. And that's fine, but the question is how we do it, right? And I'm just going to show you a few examples of things that have been, or artists that have been playing a little bit with the idea of representation and, I guess, translation. So this is Mary Solly, Dakota artist. There is a beautiful book called Becoming Mary Solly. She came to know, like 10 years ago, her nephew is a very known scholar. He works at Harvard, and he wrote a book called Becoming Mary Solly. And in Becoming Mary Solly, he just goes throughout the work of her. Like she was, in her lifetime, she was really not that well known. And these are 3 panels, so these 3 images are not separate works. And so, first, pants, people, legs, these kind of sort of very minimal shapes of humans. Then what it looks like, some kind of like Indian reservation, and then some kind of representation of a kind of idyllic form of an indigenous kind of pre-colonial community. Then the next, which is again 3 panels, but it's not big, it's like a small, like this. The next is an abstraction of the first image, right? So you have this, and then she kind of abstracted in a kind of more, let's say, modernist kind of gesture. And in the third, she did something else. Still an abstraction, but it's something else. And that something else connects to Dakota textile, but there is something about how she's also playing with the view and kind of also somehow kind of criticizing modernisms and abstraction at the same time. And that kind of opens up another big question that is, you know, like usually we will relate abstraction with modernisms, while actually abstraction is, modernisms didn't invent abstraction, of course, and you can see that in textiles especially. So Philip Deloria, her nephew, says that she was actually thinking, or the way he puts it, is that this is kind of her way of looking at the present, and this kind of form of kind of being trapped in the kind of modern trap. And then for Mary, this is some kind of like an indigenous future, like something that is at the moment not completely perceptible. So, or some kind of like anti-primitivist modernism. So again, criticizing modern representation, with that all of the kind of tradition of sort of Western philosophy, and at the end kind of thinking on abstraction as a strategy of like codifying a set of meanings, right? And this is Raven Chacon. He had a show at Tromsø not long ago. Did you see it? Yeah, he worked with some Sápmi artists there. And I think Katia Garcia was the one that was there back then, and he's a sound artist and a music composer. He's Navajo, Diné, and Raven he is the first Native American on getting a Pulitzer Prize for music 1 or 2 years ago. And he was part of a collective called Postcommodity that started many years ago, again, with composed of Native American and Brown. I think they were 3 or 4. So I'm gonna show you this sound piece, 30 seconds. I hope it works. If not, it's okay. Yes. So the piece is called Singing Towards the Wind now, Singing Towards the Sun now. So this work is based on the work comes from these sculptures that were situated in the Navajo Diné Desert, and I mean, because he's a sound artist, he built these sculptures. They are based on Diné textiles, and then the sculptures are still there, and what you listen is the sound of the wind touching the kind of metallic structure, and from that is somehow synthesizing the sound we listen. There is a relationship to, obviously, to landscape, to space, but there is kind of like a sort of inverse movement where he's abstracting and kind of enclosing a set of meanings that connects to something that is pretty close to him. And again, it's a movement kind of like inwards, which is something that you see many times. I think with Calel as well, in many cases, sometimes the opposite. But this kind of movement inwards, in the sense that art does what it needs to do, and it can be shown in any place in the world, while at the same time, it keeps a set of meanings that are to be known by a specific community. And that also connects to the relationship that also in Calel is present with accountability, and the fact that anything that you do, and I think that that is one of the characteristics, by the way, of indigenous art practices, that most of the artists are accountable with the community for what they do or what they use in the work. So once they do anything in a museum, in an institution, they go back, and there is not just a given back, but there are things that are not to be shown. So, you know, Calel will have these things that he says that, okay, this is for the studio, but it is not to show, for instance. And who decides that is not just Calel, but it's somehow the community. And then, lastly, let's just briefly chat about infrastructures and museums. And then Calel. This is the Calel's grandmother house, and the kit is, it's like how you say, like a motif. It became like a motif, like a leitmotif in many of his works. So he would work with painting, murals, and the kit is present. I should have seen the show, because now I'm thinking maybe many of these works are there. Maybe you will know, so it's okay. Right?
It's good. The kit is there.
Okay, great. That's great to know. So, well, it comes from an onomatopoeia, and like the sound that his grandmother would do to call birds to come and like kind of go in the patio in the house and eat the kind of the grains, right, that she would leave, or pieces of tortilla, and it came. I mean, there is so much to say about Calel's practice, but the thing that Calel has that it's really, really special is this kind of refusal to disassociate life and art. And it's, I mean, obviously there is a tradition in the avant-garde of live art performance, but you know, Joseph Beuys did that a little bit. But the difference here is that it's a life that it doesn't respond to the ethics of kind of the urban bourgeoisie kind of like our world, but also like it's a different just view of the world. And Comalapa has been like a kind of breeding ground of like for intellectuals, artists, anthropologists, and so on. So that connection between art and life in the practice of Calel takes the shape of sometimes very improvised, but kind of meaningful and in constant flux type of works that one day will be something and probably they will transform in the future, because the way that he works is by not working. Like he creates all the time, and he's all the time thinking through art. And that's a radical way of being an artist. Like, you know, even like the notion of studio doesn't work the same way. Like he has a space where he produces, but it's also his space is connected to in his family house, and it's also a space where they do ceremonies and they have an altar. So like the whole connection between life and art, when you speak about someone like Calel in Comalapa and kind of Cachiquel culture, it becomes completely entangled that you really cannot separate it. And that's why it makes so much sense, for instance, that he will work with his family, or that some pieces are in his house and sometimes he uses, and they are kind of like the sweater that I think I have here, that, you know, he was saying last time, I don't know if he's gonna do it, but that he was thinking that this sweater could be kind of inherited to his siblings, and then they would like add new languages, new names. These are indigenous languages sewn on the sweater. And he will wear the sweater, but also he will exhibit the sweater. So it's very impressive, and that's, I think, a form of indigeneity that and speaking from an art perspective, that I've seen that is more connected to the global South. And then again, we have nuances because, you know, there are, of course, differences and commonalities between indigeneities in Canada, Australia, Sapmi, Norway, and in the global South, Latin America, let's say, or Southeast Asia. And in some cases, I think it has to do with material culture and kind of, you know, like life in the community and how consumption, for instance, or even like, I guess, let's say, kind of liberal values have permeated places like Canada or Norway, but have not been able to permeate places like Comalapa in the way they had in other parts. So indigeneity takes different shapes, is what I'm saying. And there is no one way, and there is not a right way, of course, right? Like, so I was in Tromsø, as I was saying, I was also learning a lot from Sami artists and the kind of whole transnational view. And so this to say that, again, Calel is one example, and it's its own thing. And he, in the context of Guatemala, he comes from, I mean, in my view, is the second wave of indigenous artists. The first one started in the 90s with artists like Benvenuto Chavajay and Angel and Fernando Poyon, same community. And it's interesting because in the context of Guatemala, you see like the few, I mean, there is not a lot of art historical writing, but most of what we have kind of talks about the kind of emergence of contemporary art in Guatemala in the 90s with incredible artists, many friends, but they put like a huge emphasis on the city, like in the capital. And they don't register artists that were doing that in the 90s in the same community, but the artwork was still not that connected, right? That kind of has changed a little bit. And the other thing is that the canon of the contemporary visual arts was like probably 20, 30 years ago, not completely able to engage with these practices. Now, I mean, there is a bit of a different understanding. So even like performative practices or theater or forms of activism that were not completely, I guess, captured by kind of contemporary art discourse, for good and bad. Another example of Kid Kid, this is in Ultravioleta, and both are in Ultravioleta for his solo show. Okay, so then because I wanted to mention this about infrastructures, and I mean, I think this might be the last, I mean, probably in public, the last time that I talk about this piece, because I mean, I realized that for Tate was also, for many people, a kind of paradigmatic shift. But next time I'm going to talk about something else, because the thing is that it can become a model, and sometimes models are tricky and dangerous, right? But I'm going to tell you the story and kind of go from there. So this piece was presented in Frieze, London. I think it was 2021, I think. And it's Edgar Calel, and it's this set of stones. I don't know if, is the piece in the show?
It's from the same offering series, but not with the fruit, but with candles.
With candles, okay. Yeah, and so this was not the first iteration. The first iteration was in 2014 with a Biennale that we co-curated with Cecilia Fajardo-Hill in Guatemala called Biennale de Arte Paiz. That was the first kind of version of this piece, and then it had many different expressions. This was the first version of the piece, 2014. And it was very similar, right? Like cut fruit on top of stones, and the fruit would kind of transform, decay, rotten, and then it would be changed every once in a while. So at Frieze, this is another version. This is in Ultravioleta, the gallery in Guatemala that works with Edgar. And at Frieze, it was presented in this way, right? And what you see in the on the left side is the drawing of the stone. Like, again, kind of the representation. The whole point with the booth was that it was not, the piece was not on sale. So the only way was to, if a museum would, and that was not discussed before. It was not like it was planned, but many people wanted to buy the piece. It's also very just beautiful. And at some point, Tate was, I mean, kind of talking to Stefan from Ultravioleta and Calel and thinking if there was a different model to not acquire the piece, but kind of have some level of engagement. And the way that we came up with was to think on a custodianship. And I understand that in some museums in Norway, there are models of custodianships where artists, for instance, will give works, but they have to be exhibited so they are not just to be stored, and then eventually they have to be given back to the artist and so on. So the difference here is that this is the first time that happens with a so-called global museum. So it was very challenging because it sounds really good, but you don't know what that means also, like what it means for a museum to be in custody of a work, and also what are the legal challenges, because museums have been doing this forever, like they buy art, and there is a whole kind of legal protocol. So in this case, when the thing actually happened, and it was the time to ask the questions, Tate was really, like, there was so many conversations because the legal department didn't know how to do it. And also there were questions that were pretty practical, like what language should the contract be in? Who is a contract with the artist or is a contract with the community? And if it's the community, who represents the community, for instance? So it became like a big, very productive conversation. In the end, the idea was that it was 13 years in custodianship. After those 13 years, the work would be given either back to Earth or passed on to another institution in conversation with the artist. So, you know, we will see in 13 years. And 13 years because 13 years the Mayan calendar is based in 13 cycles. And there are two. One's it's the sacred calendar and the agricultural calendar, and those 13 energies kind of connect. So for Edgar, that made sense. And the question, I guess, then is like, what is that the museum acquire if it acquires something, right? And is it the stones, or is it the fruit, or is like you could think that it's a performance? So what you buy is the possibility of reproduction of the performance. But it was, in my view, none of those. It was not a performance. It was obviously not the stones, because actually then it happened, like you can get different, you can source the stones depending on where you present. That's kind of the idea. So if you do it here, you will source the stone from the area, and you will, of course, go to the market and buy the fruit and so on. So so it's also not the object. So like if you go back to Guatemala and think on like how people relate to, for instance, stones, like this is El Cerro Quemado, very close to where I grew up, and it's a ceremonial site. It was, you know, kind of people, it was illegal to do ceremonies there for centuries. And then, people after the foundation of the state started to come back to the Cerro Quemado. And also because everyone goes there to do ceremonies, in the 80s with the whole kind of counter-revolutionary movement with the CIA intervention, part of the strategy was to push neo-Pentecostal evangelical churches to open in rural areas, so people would kind of be Christianized. So churches started to open in the Cerro Quemado because it was the only way to bring people to, how you call it, like, it's not a mosque because that's Catholic, but to the church. But the church was not like a building, it was like a sort of camp, and the pastors would do that in those places because the only way was people going there, as it happened with many churches in Guatemala that were built on sacred sites. So people kept going to the church, not because of the church, but because those were the sacred places that they knew. These are the drawings. So here in Cerro Quemado, people is doing something similar with the stones. But sometimes they put flowers, they go and talk, they touch the stones. There is this kind of like very normal sort of relationship to it. These are the drawings. This is another version of the piece in Antigua. So, so to answer my question, what Tate acquired was knowledge, and knowledge cannot be owned, and it has to be passed, and it has to be in a like in movement. Otherwise, it becomes fossilized. And that knowledge was just thanks to the stones, to the work that Calel did. But it comes from a tradition that exceeds the object and exceeds artistic practice and exceeds academic education, of course. But that kind of connection to a history that kind of goes beyond time, or at least Western time, and kind of into the depths of ancestrality, it's kind of manifested in the stones. So kind of going back to the beginning and the bones of Cuauhtémoc, for me, practices like Calel and the art object itself is containing a form of knowledge and of ancestrality that can be only expressed through the art object. And the art object is what actually pushes and transforms the institutions with all of the kind of nuances and contradictions that come with it. So I think I did it just on time, right?
You're perfect on time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll use this for... Yes. Hi. Sorry? Ah. Anyways, while we wait for the mic to work, I have some questions, but I think it would be nice if I would give everyone else also. I'll give everyone an opportunity. If you have some questions now, it's a wonderful opportunity to dig into some of these topics. With or without the mic. If you're shy, you can also do it without.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting and inspiring talk.
Thank you.
I'm a little bit curious about this connection between ancestrality and art, and I think it was a beautiful ending. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more about that connection, and I think perhaps also what you indicated in this, the closure, the connection between rituality and ancestrality and art, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also, what about the other temporalities, for instance, like coloniality and for instance, indigenous experience of settled colonialism and art? Is there also? Mm-hmm. What kind of connections would there?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Or possibility of expression
mm-hmm.
through art?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the way I see contemporary art and its relation to indigeneity is precisely kind of the sort of confluence of multiple temporalities. So it's not just ancestrality; it's ancestrality and all of its kind of colonial violences, right? And something that I think I didn't mention is that translation, and that's why I think of translation in this way. Translation, in a way, is something, it's kind of the original scene of coloniality. So the kind of big act of translation is coloniality, right? Like in every possible way. So, but there is no way back. It happened, and it violently translated and kind of not just occupied territories, but there is something that got so entangled but it was not completely, how to say it, it was not completely gone. And my way of seeing it is that in contemporary practices like Edgar Calel, those multiple temporalities converge in the object or in the practice at large. The other thing, and it's good that you ask about rituality, because I'm doing an exhibition at the Hammer on brownness and spirituality for 2026, and the whole point is to think on how is that there is something, let's say spiritual, you could say metaphysical, but if you say metaphysical, that gets a little weird, but that it's embedded in practices of artists like Calel or Raven Chacon, you know, or like many others, that it's a level of kind of like a space of sacredness in the object, that it doesn't come from religion. It comes from something that is ancestral, and it has been passed from one generation to another. And the kind of old dichotomy of like art, not art, or art and craft, or is art functional or not, kind of doesn't make any sense anymore when you think about these practices, because you know, with Calel, those stones, for instance, also have a ceremonial purpose, and they are also a little bit like daily life, right? And the whole thing that I was saying with life and art is that daily life is so embedded into the art object that you cannot split it. And in the end, this is why it's about material culture. It is about like how we relate to different materialities, right? And that's why the bonds are interesting, because it was not someone saying like, hey, let's just talk about Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, and organize a movement. It was because of the bonds. And I think that speaks to also, I guess, the kind of power of art. And that's it kind of explains also why for so many indigenous artists, it's so kind of normal to relate to these practices, in many cases without academic background, because you don't need it, you know? And that's why also, not exclusively, but that's why it's so sophisticated, because it's kind of like ahead of his time, but it's also way behind its time at the same time, if that makes sense.
Hi. So maybe not a question, but I do think, so when you read about Edgar Calel online, not having seen any exhibitions, this institutional critique is something that pops up a lot around the practice, and then also something that I, in the beginning, found interesting, and then realizing once you start to work with him and his whole family, that it's not the institutional critique that's the core of the practice. It's not. It just becomes an institutional critique in its way of being, in a way. Mm-hmm. But it's not a very, does that make sense? It's not, doesn't feel like, you start to realize that it's not a conscious, in a way, mm-hmm. part of the artistic practice, and which I've also found enormously inspiring, and also the way that creating every day constantly on napkins or on the floor or in everything you do, and also the conversations. When working with Edgar, also he was here with 4 siblings, so it is very much a collective practice. And having conversations that are typical for institutions to ask, like, do you want to frame the flowers? It's like, no, you wouldn't frame a flower in real life, would you? And those are the answers you get all the time when you start to have these questions that are typical from an institution. Mm-hmm. Or it's dirty, or do you want to clean it? Do you want to frame it? It's like all of these questions all the time, and you get these poetic answers in the way back. But I also found when you talk about these contracts and these stones, so for everyone who's seen the exhibition, there's 2 works downstairs that are also a ritual. So for us here, it's I know that we have different receptionists, for example, and some of them every morning. We all have to light the candle and do the ritual every morning, and some of us thank our dead grandparents every morning. Some of us try to talk to our fathers. It's a very different way of, we all use it in different ways, and it's a very different way of taking care of an exhibition. That is an enormous privilege, I think. And very sort of special, but also it's real fire and it's organic material, and it's the things that the institutional critique is embodied because you realize that the humidity in the space makes it difficult for us to exhibiting anything else. For example, it is biological material, and I can't exhibit Edgar Calel next to another work from another institution, for example, because the contract wouldn't make it possible. And so the artworks makes you change the laws and the contracts, because the artworks themselves makes you ask the questions you didn't know you had. And without artists like Edgar Calel, we will not manage to change the contracts, because the questions will not be asked or raised. But through these artworks, you start to realize that you'll have to change contracts if you want to have your artworks shown next to a Sápmi artist working with biological material, for example. You have to take responsibility to make sure that's okay. All of these things, which I find enormously interesting to work. Yeah, it was a long comment, but it was sort of on a comment to many of the things that tapped into, I think.
Yeah, totally. There are many things there. I think it's important to remember, as you were saying, that also, on one hand, it's this very kind of like culturally specific, sophisticated kind of art object, but also at the same time, like with other works. Because yesterday I was at in an event like in London, and I ran into a Calel painting. And it was in this house, and it was like a painting where he's taking a selfie, or he's taking a picture. So it's a kind of self-portrait of him with his cell phone taking a picture or something. Very mundane, like a kind of like daily life, like him with his cell phone. Also, I don't know if you've seen it, but there is this work where he invited his family to paint on he has this story where they bought this car, this pickup, and they would all hang in the pickup. So they would go on the back of the pickup, like siblings and mom and dad. But it was an old pickup. So once they were going high heel, and it just broke or something. So they all came out of the back of the pickup and started pushing. And also in Guatemala, everyone is pushing cars all the time because all the cars are old. And so they are pushing, and the painting is the family pushing the pickup. It's genius. It's so good, but like, why? So what is indigenous about that, right? And also because he's talking about life, and life is many things, And then when the car goes back, and normally you put this wooden kind of structure so the car doesn't go back. So then the piece was that painting, very, very big, and then these car wooden things on the floor with this sort of pattern. And the pattern looked, for someone that is just look indigenous, whatever that means. But it was the pattern of the tires. So he's also like kind of making fun of the way we see things, and also making fun of the expectations of what we think we're gonna see when we think of indigenous art, for instance. And the other thing is that I think that like the importance about thinking through indigeneity, but also beyond or in connection to other things. It's something that I think is kind of like a fundamental task now, especially because institutions tend to go in the opposite direction. So curators, I think we need to try to actually open up instead of like closing these sort of buzzwords or identitarian niches. And I'm thinking this because, for instance, the organic materials is completely true. It's, I mean, many artists are using organic materials that are kind of challenging the conservation protocols in museums. And then you see, like now I was curating Made in LA with Diana, and many artists were proposing things that were not meant to live forever. So one was like this sort of palm sculpture. Someone was doing these slabs out of soil and corn dough. She is Guatemalan. She came undocumented to the US when she was very young. And so then I realized that obviously there is a connection and between Latinx, you know, artists of Latin American kind of ancestry generations, but that have grew up in the US, is how they call it, and indigenous artists, and the connection is because it's somehow entangled, and because you know, again, and usually going back to what you were saying about coloniality. Coloniality is what gave rise to mestizos, right? And many of these artists are mestizos, are a mix, but they grew up in the city. They don't speak an indigenous language. They came to the US when, like in this case, Jackie Mesquita, when she was 16 years old, I believe. She studied art when she was 30, and she's doing now something with organic materials. And tortilla, because, you know, tortilla is important for all of us. And so what connects these histories, in this case, is materialities. And then you realize that there are more things in common within these practices than we believe, and then you get to complicate a little bit these fixed categories of brownness and indigeneity and so on.
Hello, hello. Yes, thank you for such an interesting talk. And I was thinking, I was curious about what you talked about. You mentioned also the sort of artistic practices and how to work, sort of working with your sort of daily life as a part of your whole artistic practice in a way, and how that kind of is very different also from the idea of separating art and life, or you know, work-life balance and things that we also tend to talk about, not just in institutions, but also in artistic practices. So I was just wondering if you, could say something about that in relation to your talk, but also how this, and maybe a completely different thing, but in terms of, when you talk about translation, I was wondering also about not just curatorial practices and institutions, but criticism as well, and how that in the sort of end can respond to practices such as Edgar Calel's work.
Criticism in what sense?
Art criticism, for example, writing about, Yeah,
okay, yeah. I'll start, with the last one. I mean, something connected to probably this moment of more representation, which, to be clear, I think is good that it's happening in biennales and so on. I don't think that should not be it. What's the next step? If there is so much representation, why still feel so much to be done, right? But thinking of what you said, I mean, I think something that we see kind of manifested most of the times when go to or think in biennales and representation is that it's very hard still to move from celebration to criticism, let's say. And the way these things work, it's through celebration. You celebrate, but there has to be something else that comes with celebration. And I don't know if it's criticism, because criticism, it kind of forces you to take some kind of like distance from the object that you are, whatever that is, you're criticizing something that you see from kind of like a abstracted way a little bit. So what if we move from criticism to embodiment, for instance? Because criticism is an intellectual task, and that's fine. And art criticism is important, but thinking that as curators, how we can work from embodiment and kind of from our own relationship to artists, our own feelings, and so on. And the first question was and life and art. The thing is that, so you have this tradition of I don't know, minimalism, right, in the avant-garde, and the whole kind of myth of the autonomy of the art object. And the thing is that this is actually a very different move, and in the sense that there is no autonomy, there is interconnectedness, and we all somehow know it implicitly, but we are used to kind of our lives and the way we live our lives in cities, that is, especially bigger cities, that it works in a very kind of like, functional, fast way. And the way we came to understand art was in this kind of like sort of kind of automation and automated way of like thinking on how artists produce art, which is very complicated because, art fairs and galleries and so on put like certain kind of rhythm, right, on artists. And we were talking yesterday at Freeze with one artist, and I was asking her how to manage this kind of connection between exhibiting in an art fair and your own pace with production, for instance, or how, as an artist, when you get immersed into this kind of machinery, you find yourself so easily playing the game of competitiveness and individuality and so on. And it's curious because many artists come from very kind of like working class collective environments, right? But then you come into the art world and you kind of feel that you need to play that. And I totally understand that. It's how kind of the game was somehow set. But it doesn't always happen like that. And the difference with artists like Calel is that he's also, I think, lucky that he decided to stay in Comalapa and that he has a community. So there is a system that sustains his practice, like also ethically and spiritually, that, I mean, many of us don't have in the same way, right? So the merging of art and life is not a decision. It's not something that you do because you want to do this kind of performance and, I don't know, go to the street and do something. It's because it's the only way to produce, to work, Thank you. It was fun. Thank you.
And then go and see the exhibition if you haven't.
What was that?
Have to see the exhibition.
Oh, yeah, it's true. You have to.
We'll see it again.
Yes.